So ask yourself this question. Back in September, October, November of 2022, were you buying Bitcoin? Or were you afraid of something that prevented you from hitting that buy button?
이 강연자는 비트맥스의 창립자이자 전설적인 트레이더 아서 헤이즈입니다. 그는 최근 강연을 통해 왜 지금 비트코인 불장이 다시 시작될 수밖에 없는지 아주 통찰력 있는 내용을 전달했는데요. 단순한 예측이 아닌 경제와 시장 구조를 꿰뚫는 아서 헤이즈 특유의 명쾌한 분석, 지금부터 함께 확인해 보시죠.
I think after this 18 minutes, I should give some of you a little bit more confidence that what we're seeing today in terms of a market setup, we've seen before as short ago as 2022 in September in the third quarter. So ask yourself this question. Back in September, October, November of 2022, were you buying Bitcoin? Or were you afraid of something that prevented you from hitting that buy button, prevented you from loading up on risk assets in your portfolio so you could outperform the debasement of fiat currency? So 2002 was a very scary time. Central bankers, the people that have pumped our bags since 2008, were actually restricting monetary conditions. They were raising rates. Here's a chart from Ned Davis Research, and it shows the number of central banks that were hiking versus reducing interest rates. And in the third quarter of 2022, almost 100% of central banks that they monitor were actually in a hiking cycle, which obviously weighed negatively on risk assets globally. 2022 was scary for the bond market. I don't know if you remember, back in 2022, US Treasury bonds had some of their worst performance since the War of 1812, 200 years. Volatility was spiking in the third quarter of 2022 as yields were approaching 5% on the 30-year bond, above 4.5% on the 10-year bond, and people just didn't want to own fixed income in any way, shape, or form. And 2022 was very scary for our industry because Sam Bankman-Fried stole $10 billion of people's money. But with all that was going on in 2022, if you were focused on all the negative things, you missed what was really going on behind the scenes. And that we handed the baton off from the Fed to the Treasury, at least in America, and the rest of the central banks followed suit. So here's a little ChatGPT-inspired blister pack of, one of my favorite government officials, Bad Girl Yellen. She's got a pair of Louboutin stilettos that she's going to bash Jerome Powell's head with, and an infinite money printer. Now, what her and her department did in 2022 to address this problem of dysfunction in the Treasury market and falling stock market was to pump $2.5 trillion via draining the reverse repo program, which is where a lot of cash is parked after stimulus checks in 2020 and 2021. And this money was sitting there doing nothing. And she thought, okay, let me tinker with how I issue bonds. I'm going to issue more short-term debt, issue less long-term debt, give an incentive for those who have money in the reverse repo program to buy my debt and thus re-leverage it in the financial system. And so she did this starting in third quarter of 2022. If you look at the chart, and I'll show you in a second, the high point of $2.5 trillion for the reverse repo program was about September 30th. By early of this year, it was down to about 200 billion. And this was a story of the rocking and roaring 2022 to 2025 markets where Bitcoin and a lot of other things did very, very well. So here's an index chart. 100 is where we started in December 1st, 2022. Bitcoin 6x, great. Gold and stocks doubled almost. And the white line there is the reverse repo balances. And as you can see, declined about 80%. So Janet Yellen and her activist treasury issuance policy was directly responsible for the bull market that started with the collapse of FTX when Bitcoin went from 15,000 to over 100,000 earlier this year. So what did we learn that we can apply to the current situation? There's an index called the MOVE Index. It measures bond market volatility. If there's anything that you guys take away from this presentation, is this is a thing that you need to watch to understand when financial authorities will step in and print more money. So when this index gets at about 140, you have immediate response from policymakers. Back in 2022, this index hit about 140. Janet Yellen swung into action and essentially printed $2.5 trillion. Now, quantitative easing is a bad word. Everybody in this room knows it means money printing. Everybody outside this room who isn't a crypto investor knows it means money printing. And we know that money printing means inflation. And if you're a democratically elected politician, inflation is death. It means you do not get reelected. And so you can't have the Federal Reserve or the Treasury doing something that everybody knows is inflationary. We know what quantitative easing means. Buy bonds, stock market rips, inflation goes up, wealth inequality expands, people get upset, and they vote in another party. Can't do that. We have to do something else, something a bit more tricky. The people aren't going to understand that it's money printing. So that's why everything you see out of the Treasury technically isn't quantitative easing. It's something else, but the end result is there's more dollars, more yen, more euros, more yuan in the system, and Bitcoin pumps. What are you scared of? We're scared of the Trump man. He's got a fucking cardboard. He went on the Rose Garden with a piece of fucking cardboard. 2025. He said, I've got these fucking tariffs. And I'm going to beat you over the head with them. And they were so big. His tariffs were so big. They were bigger than anyone would thought they would be, and completely crashed the financial markets. And now people have a lot of uncertainty. They don't want to invest. They don't want to trade. They don't know what to do. It's scary because we have Jerome Powell. And here's my little blister pack of Powell. He's got a little Paul Volcker ghost. He's going to keep monetary conditions tight because he really hates Trump and he wants to stick it to him. So Powell's not on our side. He's not printing any more money. He says, fuck Trump. I'm going to sit over here and, be all Paul Volcker-like. April 2025 is scary because tech stocks got the stick. So the NASDAQ is down, at least when I took this chart to early April, something like 20%, entering a corrective situation. People's risk appetite is diminished because the best performing TradFi asset, US tech stocks, are getting absolutely crushed. April 2025 was scary because the bond market volatility spiked once more. So after April 2nd, Liberation Day, when the tariffs were announced, by the end of that week, the MOVE index hit an intraday high of 172. It has hit that level almost 3 times past history, during the global financial crisis and one other time. So this was a oh fuck moment. Shit is about to break. And what do we say about what happens when this index hits 140? We get an immediate policy response. And so Bessent went on television on April, I think, 10th or 11th to Bloomberg. And the journalist asked him, the Fed is keeping money tight. The financial markets, there's issues. Trump called it, queasy or something. What are you, as a Treasury Secretary, going to do to help the markets? And he responded, I have this thing called buybacks. And I'll get to them in a second. And subsequently to that date, April 9th, that weekend, we have been up only. I'll show a chart in a second, up about 30% since that date. But again, what have we reaffirmed here? We have to learn. 140 on the MOVE index, immediate policy response. The second it hit 140, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, gets on television at CNBC, says Trump's a fucking retard in his own very politically correct way. Trump immediately pivots. Tariffs are paused for 90 days for everyone except China. Bessent gets on the speaking tour talking about how he's going to do buybacks and how that's going to restore the integrity of the US Treasury market. And Susan Collins, the Boston Fed governor, went on and gave an interview with Financial Times stating that the Federal Reserve stood ready to do whatever it took to make sure that the financial markets were well functioning. Again, this is all subsequent to 140 on the MOVE index. If the only thing you guys take away from this presentation is that level.
아서 헤이즈는 이전 비트코인 강세장의 핵심 배경으로 영레포 프로그램과 무브지수를 설명했습니다. 영레포는 금융기관이 단기 자금을 안전하게 예치해두는 수단으로 팬데믹 시기 대규모 경기 부양책으로 인해 시중에 풀린 현금 상당량이 이곳에 쌓여 있었습니다. 2022년 제닛 옐런 재무부 장관은 이 유휴 자금을 다시 시장으로 흘려보내기 시작했는데요. 단기 국채를 더 많이 발행하고 장기 국채 발행을 줄이는 방식으로 투자자들이 영레포에서 자금을 빼내 국채를 사도록 유도한 것입니다. 이로 인해 시장에는 약 2.5조 달러의 유동성이 공급되었고 비트코인을 포함한 위험자산 시장이 다시 살아나기 시작했습니다. 한편 헤이즈는 이러한 유동성 변화를 사전에 포착할 수 있는 지표로 무브지수를 제시하는데요. 무브지수는 채권 시장의 변동성을 나타내는 지표로 이 수치가 140을 넘을 경우 정책 당국이 즉각 개입하는 경향이 있다고 말합니다. 실제로 2022년 무브지수가 140을 돌파하자 재무부는 유동성 공급에 나섰고 2025년 4월에도 트럼프의 대규모 관세 발표로 무브지수가 172까지 급등하자 시장을 진정시키기 위한 정책 대응이 즉각 이어졌습니다. 이러한 흐름을 바탕으로 아서헤이즈는 향후 비트코인 상승장을 이끌 핵심 요인은 유동성과 그 신호인 무브지수에 달려있다고 강조합니다.
So if you don't understand buybacks, here's a very simple explanation. Essentially, it's a budget-neutral, supply-neutral way for the U.S. Treasury to influence how much leverage is given to marginal buyers of Treasury debt. And so what they do is they issue a new bond, they take those proceeds, and they buy an older bond. Now, this is important because there's a large section of Treasury traders, these hedge fund managers, and what they do is they buy a bond in the cash market, they sell a futures contract, and they wait for that very narrow spread to collapse. And if you apply a lot of leverage to that, you can make good money. So the gating factor in how much they can do, how much they can show up at the auction and buy, is how much leverage the banking system can give them. And on the banking side, a new bond that's liquid has a less capital charge than an old bond that's illiquid. So if Besson is able to take these old illiquid bonds off of these RVs trading books, then these guys can relever, go to the bank, get more leverage, create more money, show up at the auction, and buy debt at whatever price Besson wants to sell it at. So these RV hedge funds are the marginal buyer of Treasury debt. And Besson is doing all he can to make sure that they can show up and participate and make sure the US government is funded at a very affordable level. And this is how liquidity is pumped into the market. So yes, technically speaking, a buyback is not quantitative easing. It is not money printing. It does not really influence the amount of dollars in the system, but the second order effects are positive for dollar liquidity and obviously for our bags. So this all predicated on, will there be more US borrowing at the federal level? So if we look at October to March, this is the latest data we have data from, versus October to March of 2024, we are already tracking 22% higher in terms of a fiscal federal deficit. So Biden spent a fuck ton of money, he spent $7.1 trillion. Trump is starting to spend even more than Biden, even regardless of what he's actually saying. The US taxpayer is broke. A large part of driver of tax returns in the US are capital gains, meaning the stock market. So I just showed you a chart of the NASDAQ down 20%. People aren't making money in the stock market, they're not paying taxes. So we don't have their official data out yet, but there's an expectation that the April 15th personal tax deadline, the amount of money that the Treasury Department received is less than usual. This particular analyst says up to $500 billion. We'll find out in the next couple of months what that number actually is. And the private sector is broke as well. We printed all this money, we gave people stimulus checks in the United States, and they spent it all. And so they can't park it in the reverse repo, they can't park it in money market funds, they can't show up at Treasury auctions to buy this debt, which means that Besson is entirely dependent on relative value hedge funds to come to auctions and fund all the debt that he was issuing. So at the end of the day, who is the sucker who's gonna buy all this stuff? So here's a little rundown of exactly how dollar liquidity is created through buybacks. So essentially, US deficit rises because our tax receipts fall. We talked about that. The US deficit outlays, how much they're spending, cannot be curtailed either legally or structurally, right? Elon's going around saying he's going to cut all this stuff. Then you have judges saying you can't cut this, you can't cut that. So we don't know where everything washes out in terms of actually the impact of this, government efficiency drive. And then if you think about the United States, the large part of spending is Social Security, Medicare, healthcare for old and the sick, and the defense budget. And these are the third rail of American politics. You cannot cut these things or you will not be reelected. I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent. Nobody can touch these things in the US welfare state. And so because the deficit is rising, and I showed you a chart rising 22% already year on year, they have to fund a larger deficit. Now, if you fund a larger deficit out of savings, there's no net impact to the amount of dollars issued in the world. That's why I showed you this chart of the stimulus checks and how much excess liquidity there is on the private sector in the US. They're broke. They don't have any money. They can't buy any bonds. The banking system can't fund it. Their balance sheets are full. Basel III, all these regulations put in after the global financial crisis in 2008 have restrained the ability for the US commercial banks to continue gorging on treasuries. And in actual fact, they got kind of fucked in 2023 when the bond market collapsed and we had, 3 banks go bust in the span of 2 weeks. So the willingness of the banking system to show up at auction and buy really highly priced treasury debt is not there. So the only person or entities left are these relative value hedge funds that I talked about. And what do they need? They need leverage. They need leverage from the banking system. The banking system has too many old bonds. Best is going to take those old bonds off their balance sheet, is give them new bonds, give them more leverage, and they're going to show up at auction and buy more debt. And this is how dollar liquidity is created in the system. And so the question is, did you buy Bitcoin on April 9th? When we had this policy pivot, 140 on the move index, we had every manner of person within the US administration changing their tune to support the markets, and Bitcoin is up 30% around since then.
아서 헤이즈가 말한 바이백이란 미국 재무부가 신규 국채를 발행해 자금을 마련한 뒤 과거에 발행했던 구국채를 다시 사들이는 방식을 말하는데요. 표면적으로는 국채 공급량에 영향을 주지 않는 중립적인 조치처럼 보이지만 시장에는 실제로 유동성이 공급되는 효과를 가져옵니다. 그 구조를 간단히 설명드리면 헤지펀드들이 국채를 적극적으로 매입하도록 하기 위해서는 레버리지가 필요한데요. 재무부가 유동성이 떨어진 구국채를 다시 사들이고 대신 유동성이 좋은 신국채를 공급해 줌으로써 은행들이 다시 자금을 빌려줄 수 있는 여건을 만들어주는 겁니다. 이렇게 되면 헤지펀드들은 다시 자금을 조달할 수 있게 되고 국채를 적극적으로 매입할 수 있게 되는 구조가 완성됩니다. 실제로 2025년 4월 무브지수가 140을 넘자 정부가 바이백을 선언했고 그 직후 비트코인은 약 30% 상승했습니다. 아서 헤이즈는 이러한 미국의 움직임이 앞으로 다시 한번 비트코인 강세장을 촉발할 수 있는 도화선이 될 것이라고 강조합니다. 그리고 혹시 거래 수수료 절반을 다시 환급받는 방법 아직 모르시나요? 단 5분만 투자하면 평생 수수료 돌려받는 셀퍼럴, 선택이 아닌 필수입니다. 자세한 내용은 영상 더보기란을 확인해보세요.
But don't worry, we're going to $1 million by 2028 because we're going to print more money in Trump's 2.0 than Biden did in his term. Why? For all the reasons that I just mentioned, we're already tracking at 22% higher. What happens if this China-US sort of divorce goes badly and both sides stick to their own guns and don't want to compromise? Well, is Trump and the Republicans going to not try to win a 2026 midterm election? Of course not. They're going to do what they need to do to stimulate the economy, to create the impression of growth and strength so that they get reelected just like any other politician. And so because of this secular change in the relationship between the two largest economic and military powers is going to be funded with printed money, Bitcoin is going to go much higher than it did from 2022 to 2025. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a road to $1 million Bitcoin. Thank you.
오늘 영상 도움이 되셨다면 구독, 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.